Hearts be always acceptable to you, O God, our strength and our salvation. Amen. Please be seated. What was happening in Jesus' world on the day that he arrived in Jerusalem riding on a donkey? Into what atmosphere was Jesus entering as he traveled along that dusty road into the big city? Well, it was Passover, and what would have been happening during Passover? Well, Passover was and is a time during which the Jewish people would tell and retell the story of their escape from slavery in Egypt. It was a time when the Jewish people would recall in great detail the entirety of the Exodus narrative. It was a time when they would recall how God once led them out of captivity and into freedom. Now, in the context of Roman-occupied Palestine, while the Jewish people were not technically enslaved, they weren't entirely free either. Increasingly, groups of so-called bandits are noted in the historical record of Jesus' era. And while some of the groups of bandits were simply petty criminals, others would more accurately be characterized as social revolutionaries who were dedicated to the overthrow of Roman rule and were willing to use violence to achieve their aims. Thus, some bandits might be more appropriately called guerrilla warriors. And the historical record reveals that these guerrilla warriors, those who were understood to be working to right social, economic, and political wrongs, were usually protected by villagers throughout the countryside, in spite of the threat of Roman retaliation against them. Tensions between the Romans and the guerrilla soldiers always escalated to fever pitch during the 8 days of the yearly Passover festival. As the Jewish people recalled their foundational journey to freedom, their present experience of oppression would have weighed all the more heavily. And in that atmosphere, some were moved to act in defiance of their Roman overlords. So, of course, during the Passover festival, the Romans always sent extra troops to Palestine in an attempt to keep the Jewish people subdued. The extra soldiers would have entered Jerusalem in their full military regalia, mounted on strong, shiny horses, with enough weaponry to kill off the whole Jewish population if it were to become necessary. In light of the bravado of this brash military entrance, then, with its vivid displaying of Rome's power to subdue and to punish, Jesus' more humble entrance into Jerusalem was pure counterpoint, commentary, and critique. A critique of both the Roman occupation and of the guerrilla warriors who used violence to oppose it. For Jesus knew that there was a different and better way to reclaim freedom. But it was a difficult way that tended to be quite unpopular, a way that even his closest friends and allies couldn't fully understand, a way that led to the cross when it could have been otherwise, a way that we rather blandly call nonviolence, when perhaps we should call it radical peace or even revolutionary peace. Indeed, all along, many people had been hoping that Jesus was the Messiah, the leader who the Jewish people had long awaited to save them from their enemies and from their relentless subjugation. But again and again, Jesus disappointed people's hopes, even as he aroused new and different hopes. Jesus was simply not the type of leader that most people had imagined the Messiah would be. A leader who would generate a popular uprising to crush Israel's oppressors with military might. Jesus just didn't quite fit the Messiah template. For instance, rather than only critiquing the Roman occupiers, Jesus also critiqued his fellow Jews, using tricky tales called parables to undermine all sorts of popular pieties. Surely the Messiah would be unifying Jews against their common enemy rather than sowing seeds of division among them. And what kind of Messiah would so studiously avoid publicity, even as his ability to heal drew ever more attention his way? Why did Jesus feel the need to be so secretive? Did he have something to hide? Wouldn't the Messiah want to draw bigger and bigger crowds so that they could eventually become an army? And finally, what kind of Messiah would forego a security detail, especially as those in power were growing increasingly concerned about and even threatened by his popularity? Why wasn't Jesus prepared to protect himself and his disciples from harm? Wasn't his cause and his life worth defending? How could anyone accept death without putting up a good fight? We don't know precisely what Jesus knew about his impending death, his forthcoming resurrection, or the meaning that both would come to accrue. In the four Gospels, Jesus says quite different things in those moments just before he breathed his last. And these differences suggest a wide range of possibilities for what Jesus may have known about what was to come. For instance, Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And it is finished in Matthew and Mark. In Luke, to those crucified alongside him, he says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And then, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." In John, he says only, "I thirst." So what did Jesus think was happening to him? And what did he think was coming next? Can we definitively say? On the basis of Scripture's varied testimony, it's difficult to pin down a sense of Jesus' interiority as he approached his death. But we can quite confidently say, I think, that Jesus' faith and trust in the one he called Abba, Father, is what enabled him to approach his death in a rather remarkable state of peace. Yes, there is anguish in the narrative, but that anguish only seems to amplify the hopefulness of the forgiving, accepting peace that Jesus radiates, even in the face of his executioners. Crucifixion, you may know, was a method of execution in which victims were ultimately killed by asphyxiation. Jesus might very well have choked out the words, "I can't breathe," as he hung on the cross, in proleptic solidarity with Eric Garner. One of the horrors of the early months of the COVID pandemic was witnessing people in acute respiratory distress being positioned prone in their hospital beds, and then in so many cases being placed on ventilators, and then in so many cases breathing their last away from loved ones, perhaps on an iPad. Witnessing another human unable to breathe freely incites primal fear in the very depths of our being, in our very own respiratory tissues. Our diaphragms tense in empathic constriction. We wait, willing the other to inhale again, so that we can allow ourselves to inhale too. We hold our breath. The anxiety rises. Will there be another breath? It seems almost impossible to be at peace without ample, free-flowing breath in our bodies. And yet, as he neared his death, Jesus was most certainly all but breathless. But in the face of this incapacity, Jesus does not seem to have grown despondent, nor did his peace diminish. Jesus was very much present with those holding vigil at the foot of his cross. And his final exhalations were whispers of peace, benedictions breathing into his friends' lungs, infusing their bloodstreams with the remnants of his own life. Just as he had said to the disciples at the Last Supper, so Jesus says again from the cross, through the sheer intensity of his dying presence, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Do not let them be afraid." To his dying breath, Jesus was speaking peace to those who surely wished retribution upon those who had tortured their teacher and who were now slowly killing him. The peace I give you is a gift the world cannot give. The peace I give you is a gift the world cannot give. But how could they be at peace when they were losing the person who had given them hope and meaning and purpose and love? How could they do anything other than rage? Jesus' nonviolence was a difficult way. Even his closest friends didn't fully understand it. Why was he hanging on the cross when it could have been otherwise? Why hadn't he fought? Why hadn't they fought for him? Even if they were destined to lose, at least it would have been better than this, than having done nothing and now just waiting for the end to come. Stay with me, Jesus says. Stay here and keep watch with me. Stay awake. Please, stay awake. And so we will. Amen.